How's everybody doing today? Right on. Well, I appreciate being here. Appreciate the chance to be with you all. And I was just out back talking to some of the rangers and some of the folks from Big South Sport Adventures, and we're going to do a horse-drawn wagon ride a little bit later after the talk, if anybody's interested in doing some wagon rides. But we brought up the idea of mules. How many of you guys have ever ridden a mule? There's a hand, there you go. I've got a white mule by the name of Peter Rabbit. He's got big white ears. When he was born, they said, well, that looks like a big rabbit. And so that's been his name ever since. And made me think when we were talking about mules that one time a mule saved my life. And after that experience, I started thinking about how my great-grandfather got killed by a mule. It's kind of interesting, full circle. He got kicked in the belly. This was a good while back. You got to watch out for those mules. They'll kick if they get fearful, and you really have to sort of watch and understand them. That's part of their reality, those feet, those legs, and that's all they have to protect. I wasn't there. That was years before I was born, but I do remember the day that a mule saved my life. It was a strange occurrence. I was by myself, and I was way, way up on a mountain in Montana, in northwestern Montana, in a national park, a really beautiful park called Glacier. If any of you get a chance to go there, you should go see that park. And I was up in the back country, just walking quite a bit off the trail, and I was up where you couldn't hardly tell where there was a trail because it was mostly covered with snow and ice and rock, and it was above the trees. There weren't any trees at that elevation because you get up above the trees, a lot different than the beautiful landscape around here. That's one thing I like is diversity, like different places, different things, different people, and sort of checking out different people's stories and ways of life. So that's one reason I was up there, and I was visiting some Blackfeet Indians and just enjoying the different terrain. But I decided to spend a week or two just by myself, and I had my backpack on, and I had a few supplies, and I didn't really want too much food because the bears, there's a lot of grizzly bears there, and they'll come in and take your food. So the less you have, the less they have to take, and kind of keep it simple. I was just keeping it streamlined. And I was walking up on a big ice-covered sort of crest of a mountain. And I was doing just fine, kind of crunching along, and just looking, and massive drop-offs, so thousands of feet down, beautiful, colorful lakes, and bright blue sky. And all of a sudden, the ice broke out from underneath my feet, and I started sliding, and I got faster and faster, and pretty soon it was starting to hurt. And what I did is I just pretty quickly figured out if I arched my back and put the pressure as I was flying down the mountain on my backpack, basically I started just skating on my backpack. I just had my heels touching. And I was getting faster and faster and faster, and all of a sudden the sensation changed because I was not so much on ice and snow anymore, but now I was on rocks. I was skating across rocks like that. And that was getting pretty scary. I didn't know where that ride was going to end. I did remember looking down and seeing a big drop-off before I slid, and it was just all happening so fast I didn't hardly know what to do except try to protect myself as I was sliding. And all of a sudden, boom! I ran into something. Everything stopped and got still. You got to remember, there was nobody around for miles and miles and miles. This big open quiet area. Every once in a while you hear an eagle calling. And then something started smelling real bad. And I hadn't pooped in my pants, so I knew it wasn't that. although I was so scared that if I had more time, I probably would have. But it was a big, dead mule that I had run into that apparently had slid about the same place and had come to a stop because he was heavier than I would. I think I would have kept going. But I ran into that decomposing mule, and when I got the nerve to stand up and look, he was only about 5 feet from the edge of about 1,000-foot drop-off. That was an amazing feeling to realize that dead friend there had saved me from dropping off the edge of the world forever. It would have been an interesting thing for somebody to find a red backpack with a skeleton attached to it, you know, years later. But I came over here today to tell a few stories and hear a few stories and see what we might share. And one thing about my life is when I was young, about your age, they didn't have phones. I wasn't texting like that. They did have phones, but you had to hold them like this. We still had party lines back then. It was kind of interesting change from then to now. But I would read stories in the school. I'd go to the library and I'd check out a biography. And sometimes autobiographies, and I'd read those stories and I thought, wow, this is interesting, look what this woman did. And I'd be reading a story about Helen Keller, or look how this woman led Lewis and Clark out on these adventures and kept them from dying and starving. And I'd read stories about Kit Carson and Hugh Glass and Thomas Jefferson, and I thought, wow, these are just interesting people. And then I started just contemplating, like, wow, I wonder if I could make my life interesting like they made their life interesting. And I thought, well, really, you know, I guess how you live your life is your own choice. And so when I was in 4th grade, I decided to live my life like a storybook, and see if I couldn't do some interesting things. And so by the time I was in 5th grade, I decided not to be normal. I decided that being normal wouldn't be as interesting. And so I started doing adventures, like I would go out and spend a lot of time in the forest. I thought that the forest, the wild places, were one of the coolest places in the world. And so as soon as the bell would ring, I got out of school, I'd go just run and traipsing, and I would try out things that I was reading about in the books, like about Daniel Boone and the early frontiersmen. And I learned to rub sticks together to make a fire, and learned to skin animals and cook the animals on a stick on the fire, and learned to catch food. Sometimes it would just be a little minnow, and that might be all I'd have to eat. In fact, when I was 12 years old, I decided to just really experiment, push the limits. I decided to spend a week by myself in the forest and not take any food at all. I camped out, and I was scared to death that first night that something would get me. And I stayed up most of the night. About halfway through the night, I ran out of firewood, and I had to start going out into the forest to get more wood. So I was going out in the dark and the unknown and the scary places and feeling around for some, bringing it back, and just about daylight, I fell asleep out of exhaustion, and then I went searching, and I caught a few of those little minnows, little tiny brim, that's all I could catch, and I started making a trap so I could catch more of them so they'd swim in it. And I found a little garter snake, and I smashed it on the head with a stick, and I ate that. It didn't have much meat in it, but it was better than nothing. And I found some daylilies, and they ate them. And the next night, I got more firewood because I didn't want to go through that same scary experience. I was basically knew that night was coming, and so I got my fire going, and I had plenty of firewood, and I was really scared that night. My thought is not quite as scared as I was that first night, but pretty close. And I stayed up tending my fire. And somewhere through the night, I just was thinking, just doing a lot of thinking, and realized, you know, a lot of my fear, and probably what anybody fears, is just made up in our brain, you know, just made up in our imagination. And I thought, what is out there in the dark that's really going to get me anyway? And I thought through it, and finally about halfway through the night, I decided to just go to sleep and not worry about it. And that was the last time I was afraid of the dark. And I spent a week out there by myself, gathered food, and I didn't have much food. I learned that you could do without food. That's a real important lesson to know how to do without. A lot of people years ago learned how to do without. They live on more than what we throw away this day and time. So it's been a lot of changes, but that was an important lesson for me, to spend a week and challenge myself and see what it was like to live without any support from my family or from a grocery store, from any place I could count on anything, but just live on the adventure. And over the years, I decided to try a lot of different adventures and see what I could do just by the unknown. I think that's part of what an adventure is. And I started a summer camp in the mountains of North Carolina and decided to teach young people how to live naturally. And so we take students. One of them wanted to learn how to make a knife, and so I hammered out some knives and showed him how. This is one he gave back to me a couple of years later. He hammered this out in our blacksmith shop, and he made the handle out of a live oak limb that came from a tree limb that fell down in his backyard. His name is Curtis Abear. And I remember a story I'd like to tell you about Curtis. He was about 14 years old when he asked me, he said, "Mr. Conway, I'd like to just go spend a few days in the forest, sort of like you did when you were a kid, and see if I can't use some of these lessons you guys have been teaching me at the camp." And Curtis, he was a pretty smart young man, and I realized that some of my students I probably wouldn't let this go out there because they might make some big mistakes, but Curtis had a pretty good head on his shoulders. He developed some trust in our relationship because he'd always done the right thing. He'd always been respectful and responsible and accountable. Those were some good ingredients for a good soup of relationship. And so I said, "Curtis, well, how do you want to do this?" He says, "Well, how about if I just take my blanket, and I'll take my knife, and I'll take my throwing stick," because we had taught him how to carve a special stick for throwing at animals to kill squirrels and rabbits and little things like that. And that's something that the Indians and all the early people around the world would make. That was one of their main grocery getters. And he said, "Yeah, I'll take my bunny bopper, and that way I'll be able to get something to eat with it." And he said, "No, if you don't mind, I'd like to take my sticks," because we had taught him how to gather the basswood tree sticks and rub the two sticks together to make a fire, so that he had a way of making a fire. And so we allowed him to take a couple of dry basswood sticks that were already dried out, make it just a little easier to start his fire. And we told him not to go too far away. We told him which mountains he couldn't go past. And so Curtis headed down that first afternoon. He went straight west up one of our biggest creeks. And when he got a couple miles up there, he saw a rabbit. He pulled out his rabbit stick. I don't know if it was luck or if it was skill. Maybe it was hunger. I know hunger has got me to be accurate a few times. But he got that rabbit first throw, killed him a rabbit, and so to celebrate, he thought, well, I'll make a fire right here, make a camp. And so he skinned that rabbit, and he rubbed his two sticks together, made a fire, He pulled the intestines out of that rabbit, and he went to the creek, and he laid them out and put a rock on one end of it, and the rest of them were going down in the water. He said, I can catch some crawfish when they come up to those intestines. So he already had his bait out before he'd even finished skinning that rabbit. And his fire going to cook it. And he cooked his rabbit and ate on that. And then he started making a shelter because we had showed him how to take some dead sticks and lean them up in a tree and just put a whole bunch more dead sticks, like you didn't even need an axe, didn't need to kill anything. You could just take stuff that was laying around. And he leaned them on each other, made a place for himself to lay down, covered it up completely with leaves. So it was thick with leaves, so even if it did rain, the water would run off of that. So he went down and he started checking on his bait, and he had a bunch of crawfish up there eating. So he'd catch those crawfish, and he found a flat rock with a little bit of a dish in it. And he put some water up there, just used his hands to carry the water, and it was steaming in that flat spot on that rock. And he grabbed those crawfish and just threw them in that steam and cooked them, broke them open, ate that good tail meat. And so he was eating pretty good there. And he took his blanket that night and got down in that little debris shelter that he made. And he stayed pretty warm. He was lucky it didn't rain that night. And next morning he made sure his fire was out real good and took it all apart and made it so there wasn't even a trace of him being there, because we taught him about respect for the environment, how you have to realize there's other people that might want to come and enjoy the same area. And he went out and circled around the Preston's land, which is on the other side of my land. And about the middle of the day, he saw some cherry trees that were absolutely full of cherries. He climbed up in those trees and he ate and he ate and he ate till he was absolutely full. And then he sat down to rest and he started thinking, you know, those guys back at camp might like some of these cherries. He didn't have a bucket with him. But fortunately, we had taught him how to make a basket, a fast basket, just by peeling the tulip poplar bark. Showed him how to cut on the edge of the tree and peel that bark off, because that time of year, in the spring and early summer, you can split the bark. And then you can fold it up. If you know how to make the right shape, kind of like the shape of a football, you can just fold it up and spread out a few pieces of bark to lace the edge. And he made a big lace to go over his neck to hang the basket in front of him, so when he climbed up the cherry tree, he could use his hands to pick and put the cherries in there. He made 2 big baskets and filled them with cherries. And when he walked back into camp that night, he was kind of leaning over cherries, and he said, "Thought you boys might get hungry, so I brought you some cherries back." And I was really proud of Curtis for being able to go out on that adventure and succeed so well. You know, sometimes things don't work out so good, but it sure worked out good for him that time. And a lot of that was based on education. You know, he got a little education. You can get all kinds of education. Some of it's in books, or you might get it on the computer, but a lot of it has to do with doing things with your own hands and trying stuff out and making mistakes and not being afraid to learn from them. And that's what we had given Curtis a chance to do, was to try these things out. A lot of times in our society today, a child might say, I want to do this, or I want to ride a horse, or I want to go camping. And they might say, I want to be an astronaut, or whatever they want to think of it. And somebody will say, you can't do that. You can't do that. And so often that makes me sad. At our camp, we like to teach people, you can do that. You can take a dream and you can make it come true. And I started believing that when I was a young person. My mom, even before I read those autobiographies, I got a really wonderful story that was written by Walter Pfeiffer. It's called, if I'm thinking, it's about a train. Little train that could, something like that. And that train would say, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And that train pulled all the boys over the mountains. Didn't you ever hear that story? I like that story. It's a good one. It made me start thinking, you know, if you try hard enough, maybe you can make it happen. And so I did a lot of interesting things during my young life, and about every time I got ready to do something, people said, you can't do that. And I just politely said, oh, okay. And then I just went ahead and did it. Like, I decided when I was 17 that living the modern lifestyle wasn't quite suitable for me. I thought I'll just try living like these people that I've been reading about in the books, the early Americans, the frontiersmen, the people that live more directly in contact with their food, making their own clothing, making their own shelters, basically, essentially, having their own freedom. And freedom comes responsibility. Like if you don't get something to eat, you go hungry. At least then, because there weren't government handouts. So people had to do what it took to live, and if they didn't live. It's pretty straightforward in black and white. And so it's just an interesting thing. When I turned 17, I said, you know, I think I'm going to just live out in the woods now. I'm just going to start living like people used to. Hunt and gather my food and make my clothes out of deer skins and make my own medicine and everything. People said, you can't do that. Not this day and time. I said, well, okay. And I went and did it for the next 17 years. Actually, I still do it. Well, that'd be like 35 years or so. I still live in the forest and still live naturally. But at that time, I was just a kid with the hope and an idea that there might be something more meaningful and that I might develop myself in a meaningful way. I moved out into a teepee, an Indian tent. This is America's first mobile home. And I enjoyed living in that teepee. I lived in a teepee for 17 years. Even though people told me it was impossible and I couldn't do it. And I learned a lot by living really simply and close to the land. And so that was one of the first things that I did that everybody told me I couldn't do. After a couple of years, I decided to do a walk. I decided to walk across America. That was the year after I canoed across the Mississippi River. I did that when I was 18. Everybody said, you can't do that, you'll drown in that river. And I said, well, maybe I will. And I paddled in a canoe from St. Louis down to New Orleans. And I saw a lot of dangerous places and realized why a lot of them told me I couldn't do it, because it is so dangerous that it'd be real likely to die. But I tried to pay attention and I got lucky and I made it through it, and that gave me a little encouragement. I figured, well, if an 18-year-old can canoe across part of America, maybe a 19-year-old can walk across America. So I got this idea one day to walk across the Appalachian Trail, the longest continuous trail, or at least it used to be then. And so the next day I got my backpack on and I hitchhiked up to Bandy, Maine, and got up into Todd and I started walking on the Appalachian Trail. And I walked and I walked and I got hungry because I didn't have much to eat. And my ribs started sticking out more and more and more. I got better at killing stuff and eating a larger variety of things that I ever imagined. I found out what skunk tastes like, and I ate possums and snakes and minnows, and I'd climb underneath picnic tables and pick up raisins and peanuts that people had dropped, and I'd find leftover sandwiches or half-eaten apples, and I'd kill birds by throwing rocks and knocking them in the head, or I'd snare some of them. I carried a little parachute cord on my pack where I could get to it real fast, and I could put that snare on a fast bound stick and put it over a partridge's head in just a few minutes, and I'd pull them down like that. I remember one of the first ones I jerked his head off. I was so hungry, there was all snow everywhere, and I was dancing in the light. Pretty soon I looked down, there was just a big spray of red all around me where I'd been dancing from that bird's blood spattering all over the place. I started appreciating food in a way that I never had before. And I remember one time, several weeks later, I hadn't really had much to eat in a week or two. But because I believed that I could just keep going, kind of like that train, I think I can. Then I just kept going anyway, and I saw this porcupine in the middle of the trail, and I thought, man, that looks like I could eat right there. And it started running. I said, don't leave yet. There's a party coming on. You need to be there. So I developed the technique right fast. I never messed with the porcupine, but I figured I didn't want it to go away. So I ran and I jumped over top of it. And I'd heard that they'll stick you with quills, you know, so I made sure not to hit it. I jumped over top of it, and I spun in midair, and I landed right in front of where it was going. So I came down in front of his face and yelled real loud in his face. And he stopped, he froze. He stuck all his quills up. That's kind of what they do in a protective stance. They just stick all their quills up. He was frozen like that, and I was frozen because I knew I wanted that to eat, but I didn't know how to get it. And so he started running again, and I started thinking double time, and I figured, well, it worked one time, so I jumped and spun, ran and landed right in front of him, yelled in his face. He stopped and put his quills up. This time I had thought enough, it's like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to find something I can smash him in the head with it. And so I looked around real fast, and I found a spruce tree that was dead enough that I could break it, but strong enough it could be like a baseball bat. So I broke it off just about 6 feet long. By this time, that porcupine had started climbing up a tree, and I ran over really fast. I waited till he was right about chest level for me, and I used that tree as an anvil to shatter his skull up against the tree, and it fell down at my feet, and I was so glad that I finally had something to eat. And so I started cooking that porcupine right there in the middle of the trail. I built a fire there. I figured that wouldn't leave too much of a fire starter, which is right where the footsteps were, and I put a stick through that thing and started cooking it. I looked at it for about 6 minutes, and I said, this sure is cooking slow. And I thought, wonder what raw porcupine tastes like. And I took my knife out and cut a leg off, the blood running all out. I started eating that blood running down. I was like, man, this is good. And so I finished that first leg, and it was still cooking. But I was like, I think I might try another one of those legs. So I ate about 2 of those legs while the rest of the porcupine was cooking. Really, really grateful to have something to eat. That was basically just a piece of life, and that porcupine gave it up for me. It's not like he really signed up for the program. At least I didn't see his handwriting anywhere, but it's one of those things where as we as human beings, we make an impact in the world, and we're consumers. We take something, and that porcupine got where I could take his life that day, and I recognize by breaking it down in a real simple way that he gave up his life and gave me a chance to keep living because I needed something that he had. And that's kind of the way it is with the creatures and the energy that moves through our life. And nowadays, my main meat is the deer. I hunt deer and been eating deer meat for many years. And when that deer is dead and I finish tracking it down, I'll get down there and hold my hand on it and really thank that deer, that one right there, for giving up its life, because it gave me a chance to live. And by living that close to existence and death, when death is close by, it's easier to understand and appreciate life. And so that moment on the Appalachian Trail, and many times where I pushed the limits and not lived a normal life, has given me an opportunity to learn about some of the most important things, which starts out with knowing about life itself, what it is. And by living where you see where your food comes from, you go down to the spring or the creek and you see where your water comes from, building your own house by going out with an axe and cutting down the trees and living the way that I've chosen to live, it just really helps you understand more about life. It's not always as easy, but it makes sense. And that's the way that our forefathers, the early people of this country, and all of our ancestors, thousands of years lived, and their lives made a lot more sense than this modern way of life. Because when you're just looking at television and going shopping at the mall to buy something that you have no idea where it came from, where the materials came from, basically in my study of existence in this culture of modern America, I figure one of the biggest problems, and I believe we have a lot of problems, is that we're so far removed from the source of stuff. Like we don't really appreciate it, we don't reverence it, we don't really value life because it comes to us so easily a lot of times. That's just my own evaluation. And that's the kind of thing that has come to me because I backed out of the normal part of my society. I didn't just keep going along with the flow of the other kids in the neighborhood. I decided to sort of go out on a limb and be different. And everybody said, you can't do that. I thought, well, let me just try it anyway. And I'm glad I did. I remember on New Year's evening one time I had a piece of chocolate and a dead squirrel I found on the side of the highway, and that was when I was riding my horse across America. I've done a lot of big cross-country adventures. When I rode that horse across America, people said, you can't do that. They told me over and over. And the other thing I heard, especially when I'd sort of already gone over 1,000 miles and I was doing that, they would look up at me and say, gosh, I wish I could do that. And I had one answer for everybody that told me that. You can. All you have to do is get on a horse and start riding. That's what I did. That's the only reason I'm doing it. And that was a dream that I had. In fact, it's so important to believe that you can and hold on to dreams. One night I was sitting around the fire and it just came from me, just like a bolt of lightning hit my head. And I was telling my friends, I said, I'm going to ride a horse across America someday. They said, you can't do that. That's impossible. There's highways, there's fences, there's laws, there's regulations. You can't do that. I said, well, I thought it was a good idea. And I held on to that idea. And it's been fun to meet up with some of my friends years later, and they would say, yeah, I remember you telling me that. We sat around the fire, you said you were going to ride a horse. And I said, yeah, that's just a dream I had, and I held on to that dream for 17 years. People would remind me of things like, you don't have a horse. Like, oh yeah, but I can get a horse. And eventually I did. I got this wonderful Morgan horse named Palisade Hasty. And he was a national champion endurance racer. He would go 100-mile races, and he would win about every time. And my friend Johnny Rule, who's a wonderful horse trainer, he found that horse for sale because the owner died, and he said, you know, Eustace, I think I found that horse you've been asking me to find. This sort of matches your personality. And he helped me get that horse, and I trained it for a while, and then one day, Christmas Day, I started out riding west, and I rode and rode, and I got out there to the western coast. I made it happen. That was a dream that I held on to for 17 years, and finally I just got on a horse and started riding. I made it happen. Just whatever got in my way, or whatever hardship, and I was hungry then too. Sometimes I was really tired and didn't know how I was going to get food from my horses, didn't know how I was going to get water from my horses, didn't know how I was going to get a shoe from my horse, didn't know how I was going to repair my saddle. My feet were hurting so bad. I just got a piece of inner tube off the side of the road. I found all kinds of stuff on the side of the road. And I picked that inner tube up and wrapped it on the middle of my stirrup to kind of give me some arch support, and that made it so my feet didn't hurt so bad because I was posting a trot all day long. It's like doing calisthenics about 8 hours a day, every day, day after day after day after day after day after day after day, and so on and so forth. So at least my legs got in pretty good shape on that journey. But I just have to believe in it and go out there and do it. Some years before that, I kayaked across Alaska and went out there with the whales and the grizzly bears and learned a lot about the native people of Alaska and the fishing and the remote living, and enjoyed that. I like going and hanging out with different people and seeing how different people live. Lived with a bunch of different Indian tribes and learn some of their secrets, their ways of weaving baskets, making medicine. One of my favorite things to do is just get back to people that live close to the earth. I bet some of you like to hunt. I bet some of you like to grow a garden and put up some beans. We put up 150 quarts of beans last week. Yesterday we put 2 bushels. I got a pretty nice bean patch this year. Make compost from the horse poop and the stall litter. We've got a sawmill, and we collect all the sawdust and put that down each day for the horses and the mules. Peter Rabbit's there. That white mule, I bought him in Vicksburg, Mississippi when I was riding the horse across, and he became my pack mule so I could carry stuff. And I bought him from a fellow that had raised him, and he was 7-year-old, and I decided I'd try him out. He was a little bit wild at first. I had to show him who was boss, because he didn't have any idea that he was actually going to follow directions and work with me, but we worked things out, and he's been with me ever since. He's been on quite a few horse journeys. In fact, one of the last ones, well, actually I'll tell you about the last one. He was on the, have any of y'all seen my friend Preston Roberts? He does a television show with me sometimes. His son was turning 16 years old, and I wanted, and more so Preston wanted to give his son a passing rite, like a ceremony of coming into manhood, want to challenge him. So we took him on a horse journey. It was one that everybody told me was impossible. I said, I want to go thousands of miles at speed, like a marathon journey, and go way faster and further than anybody in all of human history's ever done. Thousands and thousands of miles. And they said, you can't do that. That's impossible. Take a horse 50 miles or 60 miles a day, day after 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 day. And so horses can't do that. I said, let's see about that. And so Joseph, Preston's 16-year-old boy, I loaned him Peter Rabbit. And we had done a little research on this horse named Hasty and found out that he had a brother, and Preston bought that horse. These are world-class endurance animals. Peter Rabbit's pretty tough too. And we set out, and we went thousands of miles. We went 2,486 miles, and we did it in 56 days. And we started in Nebraska. At the Shadbolt Ranch, we went straight north across Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, went up into Canada. I was really honored and appreciative of the Canadian people, the border guards there. Instead of giving me a hard time, they lowered the flag, big old Canadian flag, and they presented it to me in honor of my challenge and my journey. It was an interesting feeling to be up in Manitoba looking back in the distance. I could see the little border patrol station, and it had a naked flagpole. I thought, these men believe in me. I think I can. I went all the way across Saskatchewan. That's a long state from the east to west. Then I went into Alberta, and I went straight towards the Rockies. I could see them. I went straight till I was at the very foot of them. I turned south and I went into Sweetgrass, came back in the States. They had a lot to say about me moving horses across the country. I had a hard time with that government program. But thankfully I made it back in, and I went and did a diagonal from that very area that I slid, and that mule saved my life, all the way from the northwest of Montana to the southeast of Montana. Found a wonderful dog on that Blackfeet reservation. She just died recently, but I had her for about 15 years. I think she's about 17 years old now. Buried her beside the skeleton of that best horse who passed away years after this journey, Hasty. I dug up one of his bones. I remember about exactly where I buried him, and I put them two together because they really enjoyed running across the plains, that prairie country. In fact, that's what I named that dog, that little blue heeler named it Prairie. Did that big long diagonal across there, and then we hit the bottom. And we came into Wyoming and went straight south all the way across Wyoming and back in Nebraska. We did 80-something miles that last day. That was a long day, that 80 miles that day. And I guess, I learned a lot from that journey and all these journeys, but one of the best things I remember is that you believe that you can, and you really go for it with all your energy. Complete belief that you can do amazing things that other people would think are just absolutely impossible. But it's a lot to do with just what we believe, and that's this is the storytelling festival, and the little train, that the story was written about, believing that it could do it. Is one story that I believed in that gave me a belief system, and that's really what stories are. They transfer beliefs and ideas and values and inspirations. And so that little train gave me the concept that if you try hard enough, you can make it happen. And so that's an interesting result, that a person can hear a story that can give them enough inspiration and carry them through a lot of challenges. And so that's some of the real deep value of a story. And so I appreciate the chance to come here today and tell you guys a few stories. Actually, I didn't tell you too much about Peter Rabbit, the white mule, on that journey. His first day on the journey, he did 50 miles, and he never did less than 50 miles a day after that. Just 50 miles, cranking it out. And that's just hitting the ground running. I was pretty proud of that Peter Rabbit. And really, I took him on before that was me and Preston. We started on the coast of Virginia, and we went straight south along the coast of North Carolina, meeting all kinds of folks and hearing their stories about horses. That's where I really learned the most about horses, other than just living on top of them, learning how to floss my teeth at a trot and stuff like that, and just living on them and living with them. But we went straight down the coast of North Carolina, down the coast of South Carolina, and we got a little bit south of Myrtle Beach. I started back up towards my home in the mountains of North Carolina. And unfortunately, Preston, he had to go back to work. He was a school teacher in the public school there. And so I was on my own, just me and Peter Rabbit and Hasty. And I started really pushing the miles, just finding out what a horse and what a mule can do. And Peter Rabbit, top loaded with hay and grain and camping supplies, he was trotting. And these were short winter days. This was January, end of January. He was trotting at about an 8 mile an hour trot, 8 to 9.5 mile an hour trot. He was trotting 50 miles a day, day after day. I've never heard of it. If you've ever heard of any military campaign or any animal that's carried a full dead weight heavy load like that, 50 miles a day, day after day, please tell me, because I'm interested in learning about the possibilities and history and that kind of thing. But I was really proud of him. He carried that load for hundreds of miles, and I was really happy when I got up towards my part of the country there in the mountains of North Carolina. I thought, I think this is the prettiest place that I've seen on this whole journey. It's nice to call such a pretty place home and enjoy the beauty of nature. And that's one thing that we do with this park right here. The park is taken care of and celebrated, enjoyed, appreciated, made available to us so we can see one of the most wonderful things in the world, and that's just nature. Every leaf is different, every tree is different, every bird out here, every salamander, every stone, and there's just a lot of diversity in this beautiful creation here. And it's nice to be able to share it with you guys today. And a lot of times, if I have time, I like to see if anybody out there listening to me wants to ask a question about anything or wants me to make a comment on stuff. As you can see, I've got a lot to say. When you live in the woods for 35 years without television, I haven't listened to a radio show or watched television or done any modern stuff for pretty much a lifetime. Since I was 17, I think I turned 53 the other day. I thought I was 54, but somebody said, no, I did the math, you're 53. I was like, wow, I just got a year younger. But if anybody has any questions about anything that you might be interested in, lay it on me.
How did you come about to get Turtle Island, and how long did you have it?
She asked how did it come about that I got Turtle Island and how long have I had it. That's sort of a dream that I started really as a child. I had a lot of, I think my brain was overactive when I was a child, maybe. But when I was 16 and 17 years old, I was already dedicating my life towards doing something my grandfather had challenged me to do, is to try to make the world a better place for my presence, my existence on the earth. And I thought through education, through teaching people about nature and natural ways of living and the ethics and values of our forefathers, that would be something of value. And so I bought land and got the idea of a camp, an education center where people would get completely immersed in nature with no electricity and just learn about where food comes from, help out growing plants and hunting and skinning and butchering and all the old ways, sewing the clothes and making the medicine. And so I worked towards it all my I don't even know how to use a computer, but I talked to young people, got them to set up a website, turtleislandpreserve.org, made it into a nonprofit organization, so it's easy for people to come there. And basically, just like all these stories, it started right up here with a vision and an inspiration and a belief. I think I can. I think I can. And so I've had to work really hard at making it possible, and it's really hard a lot of times. And I have to make it work financially and or make ends meet and all. But it's an amazing place. If you want to come there, you can sign up for programs. We teach all kinds of stuff. And in fact, there's many people that have looked for years on a computer around the planet say has more diverse programs than any other place in the world like that. And it's in the mountains of North Carolina. And how I made it work was just learning how to live on about nothing and do it without. Working real hard. So I gave up basic stuff like toilet paper. When I moved out, I haven't really bought toilet paper since, I never bought it. My parents were buying it when I was a kid. I just use leaves, and sometimes in the wintertime, if I get tired of crinkly leaves, I'll just use an old phone book or something like that, so it'll save money. And I've only bought 5 pair of pants, new pairs, in my life. I get used pairs or hand-me-downs, get them for $1.50 at the flea market. And I bought one brand new shirt, so I just made a commitment to do without stuff that costs money that most people think they have to have. And when I did make money, I would use that money to buy the land, because the land is the foundation of all life. You can grow your food, you can get your logs for your house, you can get the rocks for the foundation, the water flows on the land. So to me, the land was the most important. So I put all of my energy into getting the land, and actually amassed a pretty big piece of wild land, just like this park, to be preserved, hopefully forever. And be an inspiration and an education ground for people to enjoy. And so, going back to your question, we basically had an idea and worked hard and passionate and relentlessly at it. That's how that is. Appreciate your question. Somebody